Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. Keep up with the latest dinosaur discoveries and science with us. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 521st episode, we've got an interview with Kelsie Abrams from the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle, Washington.
Yes, and we also have Dinosaur of the Day, Uteodon, and Iguanodontian from the Jurassic.
And our fun fact that Komodo dragons could help explain why there is a weirdly low population of herbivorous dinosaurs in the fossil record.
Before we get into all of that, though, a quick reminder that we're doing our book club episode in our next episode, episode 522, with the Princeton University Press book, Uncovering Dinosaur Behavior. So if you haven't yet already, make sure you grab a copy. We'll have a link in our show notes, and if you use the code PUP30, you'll get 30% off.
If you buy it at Princeton University Press.
Yes.
And as somebody told us, you can use that code for other books too. So if you want to buy a bunch of books.
Excellent.
You can sneakily get some other discounts. And if you have any thoughts about uncovering dinosaur behavior or any of the other books, you should share them with us in our Books Discord channel, which is available to our patrons. And speaking of our patrons, we have 10 patrons to thank this week for helping to keep us going and make things like our book club possible. And this week we'd like to thank Pamela, Dom Likes Dinos, Lawrence, Tyrannosaurus, Brooke, Chris, Amber, Mrs. H, Fia, and Tara. And again, if you'd like to join this wonderful group of people, discuss the upcoming book club book with us, or any other books, or any other dinosaur or non-dinosaur topic, then please consider joining our Patreon, patreon.com/iknowdino. And without further ado, we're going to get into our interview with Kelsie Abrams, but in the interest of not interrupting the interview, we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now onto our interview with Kelsie Abrams from the Burke Museum. But as always, we have an extended version of this interview for our patrons. So if you'd like to check that out, you can head over to patreon.com/iknowdino or check out your premium content feed if you've set that up. And there'll be a timestamp in that extended interview so you can jump to the end of the interview and pick up where the interview leaves off. We are joined this week by Kelsie Abrams, who's the Paleontology Fossil Lab Manager at the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle, Washington. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I think it's so cool that you go on digs and you also prep fossils. So it feels like, for me, I think farm to table. It's not quite like that. But
field to table, prep table?
Field to, yeah. Yeah, because you still have a table in the prep lab, right?
I do. Yeah, I'm lucky that I get to have my hands in kind of all the different pots of paleontology, from finding the fossil to getting it out of the ground to getting it out of the rock to getting it to the researcher, and then getting to have a little bit of a handle on the research that's going on with that specimen. So I'm really lucky to be in a part of paleontology where I'm in all of paleontology.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Did you start in the field or did you start in the lab, or how did you?
A little bit of both, but primarily in the field. So I wasn't confused. I knew what my degree was in, but I started off as an archaeology student who went to a paleontology internship. I know what the difference between archaeology and paleontology, but I was interested in this paleo program, so I threw my hat in and I got a field internship in 2010. And I showed up to the museum and I said, yeah, I like dinosaurs, like Brontosaurus, Dimetrodon, Pterodactyl. They're great. And then everyone stared at me and went, you're an archaeologist. What are you doing here? And I learned how to dig up Jurassic dinosaurs that summer and fell in love and immediately returned to college and ran to my undergrad advisor and said, I need an earth science minor or something. I have to go into paleo now. So I got hooked by the field, but there was a small lab component that kind of put a little seed in my brain that said you can work in air-conditioned settings with headphones and playing with fossils. So a little bit of both, but mostly field.
Nice.
What Jurassic dinosaur did you find?
Or what formation or state or whatever were you at?
I was in my home state of Wyoming, and we were working on the Morrison Formation,
Nice.
which is the famous Jurassic Formation in the United States where the Bone Wars occurred with Cope and Marsh. And it's one of the most fossiliferous units in the entire country, and it's just world famous for the number of dinosaurs that can come out of the ground. And the density of these bone beds is absolutely incredible. There's more bones than rock in half of the Morrison Formation, if you ask my opinion. So the first dinosaurs that I got to spend time digging up were coincidentally now my favorite dinosaurs, which are Allosaurus, Camarasaurus, Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, and I think they're the coolest dinosaurs to the point that I've got Allosaurus tattooed on my arm.
Nice.
And then I've got Diplodocus on the other side.
Is that the skull you've got?
Yeah.
Very
That's
cool. Now I want to go back to when you were a kid in Wyoming, because I didn't realize you grew up in Wyoming. Not a lot of people do grow up in Wyoming, and it might not sound super exciting unless you're a paleontology person, because that's like one of the best places to be for paleontology. How old were you when you realized that like Wyoming is such an awesome place to be for dinosaurs and things?
Unfortunately, I didn't realize that Wyoming was such an epicenter of dinosaur paleontology until I was an adult. I didn't recognize how amazing it was as a child, even when I was walking around in the field next to my house picking up rocks with my grandpa, and he's telling me every rock is a dinosaur bone. It wasn't. They were all Jurassic squids that we were picking up, but
still cool.
It was amazing. You know, I was raised to look at the ground and pick up stuff off the ground and told that everything was a dinosaur bone. And it wasn't until I was in college and grad school and learning about paleontology and the history of paleontology that I realized that Wyoming was a big deal for dinosaurs. But as a child, they were everywhere, and they were at the museums and on t-shirts and at every college, and every tiny town in Wyoming has a dinosaur museum. Most of them are free, so it's a good place to take your kids if you're bored. And so I got exposed to a lot of local dinosaur culture and dinosaur discoveries, including in my hometown of Casper. We have the Tate Geological Museum.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we've been there.
So I got to go there a lot, and I actually apprenticed under J.P. Cavagelli for a time, because if you have a great fossil preparator in your hometown, you better go bug them. And so I was exposed to a lot of dinosaurs as a kid, but I didn't really figure out that Wyoming was a hot spot for dinosaurs until college.
Gotcha.
I was going to say, you're hearing that there's dinosaur bones around you, there's all these museums and everything, but you still went to anthropology first.
I did. I loved ancient Egyptian and Roman archaeology.
That is super interesting.
It is.
And there's more. One of the nice things about archaeology is there's a lot more information. With paleontology, you're really working with scraps to try to piece things together. But with archaeology, you can find a lot more and sort of piece together a better view of the ecosystem and the people and everything.
I was just thinking it's scraps with dinosaurs, but it's like big scraps.
They are big
and
scraps.
And then with archaeology,
it's little scraps.
Little scraps, but you know more.
Yeah.
It is.
More little scraps.
It is little scraps versus big scraps, but I think that I have an advantage as a paleontologist, and especially a field worker or preparator with an archaeology background in addition to my paleo background, because I'm aware of the difference between an archaeological excavation and a paleontological excavation. Both of them are a single data point that you get one chance to go capture all the information possible from that site. If you don't capture that data when you're excavating it, you don't have a chance to go back and recover that data if you blew through it. And the approach to digging up dinosaurs, because they're big scraps, is very different than the approach to digging up small scraps. You know, archaeologists bring up the grid square, and they're going centimeter by centimeter through the soil, and they're looking at soil horizons, and they're keeping things flat, and they are documenting out the wazoo. And paleontologists, I don't want to call us sloppy, but we go a little bit faster. We don't pull out the meter by meter grid squares all the time. We don't go centimeter by centimeter. And so the data capture is very different. And as a fossil preparator, it's supposed to be my expertise to understand what are all the different types of data and information that you can get out of a specimen or a site. And what are all the different ways that in collecting that data, are you going to impact it or change it or manipulate it or influence the long-term stability and use of a specimen in collections and research? And so having that archae background, I think, makes me a little more specialized in understanding how to excavate a site and how to clean a fossil, because I take a little more of an archae route, which is a lot more slow and tedious and time-consuming and might frustrate some of my coworkers. But I like to take a very slow, careful approach. I want to make sure that I don't mess anything up and that I don't lose any data and that I'm not responsible for some scientist in 100 years being unable to conclude some amazing study because I dumped the wrong glue on a fossil or I didn't collect some soil sample that they needed. So I like to try and think about all the different ways that information is used or could be important or relevant, even if we don't have some way to process or understand some sediment or some bit of information of a bone right now. That doesn't mean we can't figure out some cool use for that sediment or that fossil in 100 years.
Yeah.
So I prefer to take a little bit more of an archaeological perspective to a dig site and go slower, more careful, do more mapping, more documentation, because I'm more interested in the collection of data and information and how you do that ethically and correctly than I am with just getting the big scraps out real fast.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's really indicative too of how, because paleontology has now been around for a couple of 100 years and being able to think that far forward, because I've been doing a lot of research lately about stuff that happened in the 1800s and early 1900s. And I don't think they were considering people today looking at their work and being able to draw new conclusions. And
Using dynamite to just blow up the thing and get to as many bones as fast as humanly possible.
even the way they prepared things back then, sometimes they have to be undone now, and that can cause a little bit
Yeah.
of damage.
Yeah, whatever the strongest glue you have lying around, just slap that on there, get it back together, even if it's not quite right.
And there's a couple of fossils that they put so much plaster in, I think you just can't. And then so we'll never be able to see the full bones.
Yeah, you CT scan it to try to piece together like, oh, I think that part's real bone and that part's plaster. But yeah.
Oh, it's a nightmare. And 100%, they did not, 100 years ago when they were covering everything in plaster and paint and shellac and drilling holes through the bone to put rods in, they weren't thinking that we were going to have CT scanning in 100 years to figure out what they were faking and what nonsense they were getting into when they were making these big skeletal mounts. And now the time and money it takes to conserve some of these fossils from 100 years ago is astronomical. In the long-term financial stability of a museum, if every 50 to 100 years you're spending a ton of money to fix a fossil, that's not a good way of running things. Maybe you should spend the money and the time to prep something once and then never again.
Yeah.
Because a significant component of many preparators' jobs now is identifying what old stuff they glopped onto fossils, because you were told you need to take that gloppy stuff off so we can use that fossil, but I don't know what that is and if it's going to kill me or give me cancer to take it off. They put all sorts of things. So half of my job is learning how to identify old goo on fossils, and so I can figure out how to take it off safely, and then trying to figure out how do I get it off the fossil without mangling the fossil in the process. And so the use of historical products is a massive problem in museums nowadays because fossils from 100 years ago are falling apart in cases and falling off of their 100-year-old mounted metal structures, and we're discovering, oh, half of that plesiosaur flipper was actually plaster that was painted. It takes a lot of time and money to fix these fossils, but a lot of these fossils are really important and need to be fixed and taken care of. And then there's also the health and safety component of, I have to now figure out what this is so I can safely remove it. So moving forward, I don't want someone in 100 years to be cursing at me going, oh, what did they put on this? Now I have to get that off. Am I going to die if I take this off? It's a big concern. And so I do think a lot about materials and their long-term stability.
When you're figuring out what the goop is it more of a chemical figuring out, or is it like sometimes they have a note? There's probably no notes of this is what I put on this fossil.
Oh man, you're just like bringing up all the triggering points of preparation right now. Documentation is another thing that historically wasn't done very well when it comes to fossil preparation. They didn't think it was important, and so they didn't take notes. And then there was also a historical, I want to call it a historical legacy of treating fossil preparators like low-browed, uneducated technicians. And so if you don't think they're important or knowledgeable, you don't take notes and you don't retain records of what they're doing. And so there are no notes to refer to figure out what people are doing to fossils 100 years ago. And that's something that's changing in the modern fossil preparation landscape is now people are recognizing that you need to have documentation. And so we document every fossil treatment, mechanical, chemical, whatever, to our fossils. We have paperwork that gets scanned, that gets put in our database so that in 100 years, they can refer to notes and say, Kelsie put paraloid B72 on that fossil. I know how to get that off. But there are no records for 100 years ago. So the way that I have to identify adhesives is usually I message someone smarter than me who's been doing this for a while to get some tips. And then I have a little toolkit of just kind of med science objects. So one way to identify adhesives is a toothbrush and water. If it foams, it's probably Elmer's glue. Another way is run around with a black light. If it fluoresces orange, it's probably shellac. Another way is it flaky and coming off the surface and kind of orange and papery? That's probably Gliptol. So you learn some tips and tricks to quickly identify things so that I don't have to like scrape up a sample and spend money at a lab to have them analyze it or something like that. It's toothbrush and black light for the most part.
That's not that different from what you might have at a dig site. Well, at least the toothbrush.
Yeah, you can use a fluorescent light occasionally, depending.
Yeah, similar tools to the ones in the quarry. I'm just doing it to figure out what they dumped on it.
So since you started, you still continue to go on digs. Where are you going on digs these days? Do you go back to Wyoming or are you going elsewhere?
I do get to go run digs every year, which is really exciting because I think that as a fossil preparator, my understanding of how to extract fossils from rock is a little more specialized than some other field workers. And then I also bring to the field my knowledge of materials, so different ways to jacket a rock, different adhesives and how they react in the field and in weather, different weather conditions, etc. So I take my materials knowledge and my geoscience knowledge back to the field, and I think that's very helpful in the field. The other component is in the lab, I get to deal with stuff that was collected in the field. So I see good fossil jacket construction. I see use of adhesives that didn't work out real well. And I can go take that back to the field and inform our field workers, hey, maybe don't use X, Y, and Z on the fossil because that causes issues in the fossil prep lab. Or teach them how to create a more stable fossil jacket so that things don't shatter or that I can open it easily without sawing into a bone. I can do a lot of education in the field to make sure that it's collected properly and makes my life easy when it comes to the lab. Not only does it just make my life easier, it makes the entire process of paleo much better, right? If you smash a fossil in the field, there's only so much I can do to it, and there's only so much utility that the researcher has once it goes through that entire process. So collecting it correctly and perfectly the start is absolutely critical. And so that's very important to me. I don't want to deal with shattered fossils if I know that it was perfect at one point, and I can teach people how to do that correctly. And I love field work too, because I get to find the fossil in addition to prepping it out later. Mm-hmm. So we do a couple different digs at the Burke Museum. The digs that we do are usually dependent on the curator and their research and their research interests. So we have two curators at the Burke Museum, two vertebrate curators. We've got Dr. Christian Sedor and Dr. Greg Wilson-Mentia. And Dr. Christian Sedor works on Permo-Triassic animals, so animals from 250 million years to about 200 million years ago. And he looks at animals all around the world. The ones that he looks at in the United States are in Arizona at Petrified Forest National Park. So we go out there once a year. And I'm actually leaving for Petrified Forest September 1st to go spend 2 weeks at our quarry working on our Triassic quarry that we have out there. And we pull out every kind of animal that you've never heard of from that quarry. So
all the Triassic weirdos.
Lots of Triassic weirdos. And most of the animals coming out of our quarry are new species.
Oh, cool.
So we're working slowly on that. And then because of Greg Wilson's research, he looks at Cretaceous mammals and Cretaceous mammals going across extinction boundaries, primarily the Cretaceous extinction event. So he runs the Hell Creek Project out of Montana. And for a couple weeks every year, if not 2 months, huge field crews are out in Montana collecting dinosaur bones from the Hell Creek Formation. And where else do we go? We got to go to Kansas this year and last year to work in the Niobrara chalk. Christian Sedor is interested in expanding our Cretaceous chalk collection at the Burke Museum for teaching utility for students, and then just to represent more cool fossils from the United States. So we got to go to Kansas and collect a mosasaur this past summer.
Nice.
And so I've got a good opportunity to travel to a lot of different states across the country to go work in field work collecting back from museum or for Burke collections.
Nice.
Yeah.
Did you happen to be in the Hell Creek when that Tyrannosaurus Rex skull was discovered?
Which Tyrannosaurus Rex skull?
Oh, geez. I guess any. Yeah.
So the Burke Museum is lucky to have the best T-Rex skull in the entire world. And that's not just like I work there, I'm going to brag and beef up our cool skull. Like, no, that's a fact. We have the best T-Rex skull in the whole world. And so we have the tough slug Tyrannosaurus Rex. Not a ton of the skeleton is represented by the animal, but we have every single skull bone. Most of them were in place. There's almost no deformation to the skull. It's the most beautiful, characteristic, smooth, chocolatey color that you get out of the Hell Creek Formation. Only one tooth had actually fallen out of the skull. Just a stunning, stunning, stunning skull. That was a big, ooh, she's pretty. But she was all done and dug out by the time I was hired by the Burke Museum. So the skull was in preparation when I was hired. And it was being worked on by our Hell Creek fossil preparator, Michael Holland. So Michael was preparing the skull, and it's beautiful, and it's on display now at the Burke Museum on permanent exhibit. But the dig was all done when I had gotten there. I have got to go to the site where they found the tough slug T-Rex to kind of poke around and see if anything extra was coming out, and nothing extra was coming out. But I've not got to dig up a T-Rex skull yet.
What have you gotten to dig up?
Ooh. I have got to dig up an Allosaurus skull, an Allosaurus bodies, tons of Diphlodocids from the Morrison Formation, Mosasaurs from the Cretaceous chalk of Kansas and South Dakota, duck-billed dinosaurs, Triceratops skulls. My Triassic quarry would obviously be my favorite quarry because those are the animals that I get to prepare. So Michael Holland, being our Hell Creek fossil preparator, he gets to work on all of our dinosaurs, which is cool. And I get to look over his shoulder and say, that's a really cool Pachycephalosaurus, Michael. But I don't work on the dinosaurs. I just dig them up and then manage the prep in the lab. So I get to dig up the Triassic fossils. And those are the ones that I get to prepare. And those are the ones that Christian Zedor and I work on, and the ones that he is publishing with his students and then with the park paleontologists. So we have a quarry called K Quarry at Petrified Forest that we work every year. And the animals that come out of it are the most fun things to dig up because most of their bones are super tiny. So I'm not lugging out a 6-foot, sauropod femur that weighs 400 pounds, and I don't have to hike it like a mile and then hope that me and like 5 people can lift it into a truck. Instead, I'm carrying like at biggest like a grapefruit-sized jacket because all of the bones are really, really, really tiny in this quarry. And we get everything from Trypanosaurs, which are my favorite. They look like a chameleon with a bird head with a giant claw, like one giant claw and then 4 normal claws, and then a claw on the end of their tail. The last vertebra on their tail is modified into a claw. They're completely bizarre, and we probably have at least 2 in this quarry. So we get the weird Trypanosaurs, we get coelacanths, freshwater coelacanths, we get sharks, might have a turtle, a Triassic turtle. It took us a while to recognize it because what does a Triassic turtle look like? We get animals called Shuvosaurids, which are little 2-legged, beaked, herbivorous crocodile relatives. Phytosaurs, giant other crocodile-looking things that aren't crocodiles with like blowholes on the top of their heads. Giant amphibians that we call toilet bowl heads because their heads are the size and the shape of a toilet bowl. Those are just the things I can think of off the top of my head that come out of that quarry. But the Triassic stuff is the most fun to dig up because I get to prepare it. I get to see the research that comes out on it. And then when we're in the quarry, it's just like the biggest guessing mystery game because half of the time, we can't even identify what bone it is, let alone who it goes to, which is mind-boggling because as a paleontologist, you think, oh yeah, you can hand me any bone and I can tell you that's a tibia, that's a humerus, that's a blah, 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 and that probably belongs to a mammal or a reptile. We can get it pretty close to an identification. And then we pull something out of this quarry and Christian's like, I think this is a Trypanosaur pectoral girdle. And I go, I don't know, that's like a turtle rib. And then someone else goes, that's a coelacanth skull bone. And then we'll get 40 different answers and 40 different animals for one bone. And all of us are sitting there going, these are world experts on these animals. And we're all going, I don't know what that is. And it takes us like 3 years to figure it out. So it's a real fun adventure and like mystery game at this quarry.
Mm-hmm. The Triassic is the weirdest.
It's the best too.
It is.
Did you say if you found any dinosaurs in that area?
We do have dinosaurs in that quarry as well. I forgot to mention those because in terms of the other weirdos, they're whatever. We have, I don't know if it's Coelophysis proper, but we do have Coelophysoids in our quarry. Last year, we found a really beautiful humerus that's probably 5 inches long, a complete beautiful Coelophysid humerus. And then last year, I've worked that quarry, I think 4 or 5 years now. I found my first coelophysis teeth, or coelophysoid teeth.
Mhm.
And it wasn't just like after several years, I found one. I found like 6 or 7 in last year, which was really, really cool.
It is.
So we do have a coelophysoid in our quarry. We have another dinosaur called Chindisaurus.
Yeah.
I think that's a theropod, but don't quote me on that one either. I probably should Google it. I'm sure you will figure out what it is for me. But we do have a Chindisaurus as well. And then we have an animal called Sylvosaurus, which a year ago was not a dinosaur. And I believe as of this year, it is a dinosaur again. So some of the animals we get kind of flip-flop back and forth between a reptile and a dinosaur, depending on the year and the publication. But we do have some dinosaurs in the quarry right now.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, that's how the Triassic is too, because it's like, is that a dinosaur? What really is a dinosaur anyway? That sounds really cool. Yeah, I think that would be the one I would be the most excited about too, finding these new strange animals that have been overlooked for so long. It also sounds like it lends itself well to your attention to detail at dig sites when you're dealing with such smaller bones in these areas.
I have an eye for tiny things, not big things. So if we're out prospecting, I will walk past like a 4-foot skull, but I will come running up to Christian and say, look, I found a 1-millimeter long fish tooth. So I can find all the tiny things in the quarry, and I really enjoy that because, again, it is that attention to detail. It's me going a lot slower than everyone else because I'm taking the archaeology approach to excavation while everyone else is just shoveling out huge boulders of rock. And so I joke with Christian when we're in petrified forest that I am a human screen washer because he'll be taking out blocks of rock and I'm moving a sand grain at a time, telling him, look, I found a micro tooth or I found a tiny tooth. And he's like, we find that when we screen wash. Like, why are you pulling out microscopic fish teeth? And I'm like, because I can find them. Like, so I do put my face right up to the rock and I pick out every tiny little fossil I can find because these animals are tiny.
Mm-hmm.
You know, half these animals, the skeletal elements, once they fall apart, are just microscopic. We've never positively identified the finger bones of our Shuvasaurid, which we're actively working on. I could talk about that animal more because that's also been 6 years of my life, and that'll be a really cool publication when it finally comes out. But we don't have the fingers of this animal. It's like a maybe max 6-foot long animal, and it's bipedal, but the arms on this Shuvasaurid make a T-Rex arms look like a gorilla's. Like the arms are so minuscule and tiny and stubby that we don't really know what the hand looks like. And the finger bones could be like 1 millimeter long. Like we don't even know if we have a finger bone for these critters, but they would be tiny.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to find one.
Are you involved in the research for it at all?
Yes. So that is another really exciting component about my job as a fossil preparator. If you're lucky, you have a really good working relationship with the researcher who is actively working on the project that you are working on. And you're supposed to work in synchronicity with the researcher so that I am working to make sure that they can have the best publication possible by making sure that fossil is perfect for them and I don't ruin anything that they're going to need. You know, we're communicating back and forth. I'm saying, do you need to do isotopic work on this specimen? Because that's going to inform my decisions. I'm not going to put glue on it, right? Mm-hmm. That'll change the isotopic signatures. So I work real closely with Christian and with his students who are working on the animals from these Triassic deposits. And the researcher who's working currently on describing the Shuvasaurid from our quarry, because it is a new genus and species, is a PhD student working for Christian, Elliot Armour-Smith. And so I work real closely with Christian on a lot of his research projects, but I also talk with Elliot multiple times a week. And I've known Elliot for 5 years because we've been working on this animal. And I am lucky because Elliot knows so much more about these animals and the different parts of these animals and identifying these animals than I probably will ever know. But I spent 100 hours on a microscope staring at the ulna of this animal. Elliot, who knows everything about the ulna, spent an hour. I'm going to see and notice features on there that he might not. And as I'm preparing and uncovering it, I'm noticing features that he might not. And so we go back and forth quite often discussing features that we see. Are they real? Is that calcite? Is that taphonomic alteration? Is that an actual feature? And it makes the science more robust and it makes his conclusions a lot more accurate because you have multiple people looking at the specimen.
I think that's a really good example of how we come across this a lot, more so in recent years in paleontology, I think, where you've got people from different fields coming in or different specializations and then being able to work together. You get so much more out of it.
Yeah, the holistic approach, I think, is much more appropriate to take towards fossil paleontology. And it's like when I talk about bringing in my archaeology background, it's a different perspective that can lend itself to improving the different ways that we approach paleontology. And I really like the movement in the last, couple of decades to introduce other researchers from other fields and have them contribute to paleontology. As a fossil preparator and conservator, half of the materials that I'm using, I stole from archaeologists and art conservators because they're coming up with techniques to, keep a 500-year-old painting beautiful and around for 500 more years. And I'm going, ooh, I will use that glue. That's good. Thank you. And so using perspectives from other fields isn't completely valid and very useful because I don't have to spend the money and time to develop that method now. And I don't have to go get that degree. I can have some doctor come in and tell me about cancer growth in the tibia of humans and how that's going to relate to this cancerous growth on our Triceratops tibia. That was a really cool paper a few years ago, not by us. But I really do like that they bring in outside scientists and perspectives and that it really does make the research more robust and just better.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you also don't appreciate until you're looking at fossils. Because when you see like a skeletal reconstruction of a dinosaur and it has like the ones highlighted in white that we've found and the ones in gray that we haven't found, you think like, okay, well, we know those bones really well, or, just 100%. And then the other bones we don't know at all. But what you don't realize is just the condition of those bones varies so much from, splintered mess that's missing half of the details on it. It's all deformed. It's got beetle burrow holes in it and everything under the sun to like actually pristine. And like you were saying, unless you're preparing the thing and you're really looking at it very closely, it's easy to misinterpret one of those bumps or one of those holes as something important to the animal versus something that just happened while it was being fossilized or decaying.
100%. Yeah, I have to have a really good eye on the different textures of bone, the different kinds of bone, how bone forms, bone microstructure to help inform what I'm doing when I'm preparing the fossil and having an understanding of what it's doing in the rock. And the other component to that is because I'm the one tasked with the responsibility of removing the rock from the fossil, I better know 100% what is rock and what is fossil. And that can be a big challenge to most people first coming into paleontology in the field and in the lab is learning how to identify the difference between the two. But beyond that, like the more basic, easy to tell the difference between the two type things, like if the rock pops off and it's got a very specific color that's different than the fossil, there are instances of preservation where it is almost impossible to tell the difference between the rock and the fossil. And that's where I come in. That is my specialty, that the researcher themselves might not be able to tell what is fossil and what is actual rock. And usually the cases that are the most tricky for identifying an actual feature versus rock that's been sculpted are when you get calcite incrustations on fossils. And so the calcite does not pop off of the fossil, it is attached to that fossil. Most traditional techniques that would vibrate and pop that rock off or that calcite off, they won't work. So you have to scrape down through calcite until you are on that surface of the bone without scraping through the surface of the bone. When you're scraping calcite, calcite powders white and your tools leave marks. So you're leaving shiny marks from your tools on that calcite that reflect off your lights that make it hard to see where you're at. And the calcite is smooth and clear, and you might think that is the surface of the bone that you are sculpting, and you're not. You're on calcite. And so there is a huge array of tips or tricks that I employ to see what I am working on, because the last thing I want to do is sculpt calcite and think that is the feature, because the researcher is going to have no idea that that is not an actual feature, that is calcite, because I am struggling to tell if that is calcite or bone. And if I'm struggling, they're going to have no idea. I think about that a lot when I'm working on these fossils. I'm not an artist in the sense that I am sculpting or fabricating a fossil. I want to represent that fossil in its 100% authentic version of itself. I don't want to give a modified or creatively sculpted fossil to a researcher. So telling the difference between the bone and the rock can be a huge challenge. And it's a big responsibility to make sure I do that right and accurately, because that's going to be published on, and I don't want to be responsible for bad publication.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, because we were talking about telling the difference between bone and fossil on older stuff where people have intentionally added plaster and things to it. And now we're talking about telling the difference between bone and fossil where it's, going the other way for removal.
I want to ask, I know you said you don't normally work on dinosaur fossils for the preparation, but since you are at the Burke Museum, did you have anything to do with the Suchosaurus Rex?
I did not. So the Suchosaurus was collected and prepared before I was hired, but I did get to paint a cast of it, and that's all I can really say is I got to paint a cast of it, and I do get to go look at it and see it and touch it every day if I wanted to. But it's nearby, but I did not get to work on the Suchosaurus. I've got
a bigger appreciation. We just recently read a children's book about like the whole process of the Suchosaurus. So I've got like I feel like I've got a better appreciation for that particular fossil and the naming and becoming the state. Is it the state fossil or the state dinosaur?
State dinosaur.
State dinosaur, yes.
I'm glad it's at least the state dinosaur, not the state fossil, because there's got to be way better fossils in Washington.
Correct. Yeah. For state dinosaur, it's fine. It's the funny thing about it being our state dinosaur is it's literally the only chunk of a dinosaur ever found in all of Washington.
So I guess
we
can't
have no
complain.
other options. But our state fossil is the Columbian mammoth.
Oh, nice.
Oh. I feel like, because we met through Marissa from Ancient Odysseys, and you've got your background in archaeology and you work in paleontology, and that just seems like the perfect fit for Ancient Odysseys.
They do both.
They do both, yeah.
It really does. Yeah, so I met Marissa. She is a volunteer in my lab. So I actually met her, I think, at my previous job in South Dakota. They ran a paleo program through South Dakota, and so Marissa had come in through that lab. And then I got hired at the Burke Museum where Marissa, she's in Seattle, and so she continued to volunteer in the lab. And so early in the pandemic, I want to say in 2020, she had started to move forward with Ancient Odysseys, and she consults with me heavily, as well as with the curators at the Burke Museum. So anytime she's looking at a new paleontology opportunity, she comes to us and she says, here's this company, here's this person, what do you know? And I give her the tea, and Christian and Greg give her the tea, and we help inform and work with her on those types of decisions and those partnerships that she works for. And like small bragging right, if you go to her website, there's lots of videos of me talking about fossil preparation and paleontology. So I'm kind of like her little science helper, and fingers crossed, please manifest for me. Next year, I might be a host of a Gorgonopsid dig in South Africa.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh.
She wasn't able to get that one off the ground this year, unfortunately, because apparently people don't like Gorgonopsids.
Oh, they're pretty cool.
Which is
the saber
They're my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah.
So I talked a lot about the Triassic stuff, but the permo part of Christian Seedor's work is Gorgonopsids, and we've had 1 billion Gorgonopsid papers come out this year. I literally just shipped off a Dino Gorgon to the Field Museum yesterday that I spent getting packaged. So the Gorgons are the coolest thing ever, and that's part of the reason she had fishtailed off of Bruce Rubidge with me, because Bruce was going to run the Gorgon dig, and I wanted to sell a kidney to go dig with Bruce Rubidge on a Gorgon. So next year, maybe I'll get to be a host if things continue the way that we're hoping, that I'll get to go on this Gorgon dig and be like the little scientist host on the Gorgon dig. So I love working with Marissa. I really want to promote her company and what she's doing, because I think it's an amazing opportunity to get citizen scientists on a lot of these digs that no one would ever have an opportunity to do. And then she also helps promote fossil preparation and my ability to go to South Africa and dig up a Gorgon. So I like working with Marissa, and she's got a really good partnership with the Burke Museum as well. So Ancient Odysseys is working with the museum to provide digs that would fund different aspects of the Paleum department and then support staff research. So we love Marissa, and we love what Ancient Odysseys is doing. So anytime she sends me something, I love it, because I'll also send her things.
Nice.
That's great.
That's too bad about the South African trip, because we had talked to Bruce earlier, and that was a few months ago. So it sounds like things have changed.
Yeah, I don't think they got enough spots, so I don't think it got off the ground.
Well, hopefully next year.
It is. The tricky thing about South Africa is it's very far from a lot of, at least our audience, and I think a lot of dinosaur enthusiasts generally, because it's way down there.
Yeah. And, her hominid dig in Africa sold out, but that one I'm not surprised by. Like, you used to be able to count on 2 hands how many people got the opportunity to dig up a hominid in Africa. And now Maurice is just casually like, yeah, you can come on one of my hominid digs. So that's sold out. But the Gorgons, I think we need to do a little more promotion on the Gorgons and get Gorgons out and get the public more excited about these ancient beasts that are way cooler than anything else.
Yeah, what do we usually describe them as? Like saber-toothed wolves or saber-toothed dogs? Is that like the colloquial Gorgonopsid name?
Arjun Mann, who's the curator of early vertebrates and amphibians at the Field Museum, calls them big saber-toothed dogs.
Yeah.
And I argue that I think they look like cats just based off the nose. But I'm also a cat person, so I could be full of it when I'm like, no, they're a cat.
They have kind of a
look
long snout on them for a cat.
Oh, I don't have any sitting around me right now. Yeah, they do have a very long, almost like a hatchet-shaped head, too.
Yeah.
Just awesome animals. The one that I shipped, the Dino Gorgon that I shipped off yesterday, the canine is, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches long. And we've, in our collections right now, and that was a fun story, we have 2 specimens, one 100% identified, the other one we're just sus based on the size. But we have Inostronsevia africanus, which is the African version of Inostronsevia, which is one of the largest Gorgonopsids ever known. And typically it was only known from Russia and Siberia. But then a year or 2 ago, Christian Kammerer published and presented on, hey, I found an African Inostronsevia. And then my Christian came running back and went, oh, we have one. I just didn't know what it was. And he ran to collections and he gets this chunk of bone and he goes, can you make sure that, can you prep right here and see, like, is that the 4th tooth socket? And so I ran over and I started prepping around and I went, oh, that's an alveoli. That is a 4th tooth socket. And then we CT scanned it just so no one could argue with us, just to be sure. But it had the 4 tooth sockets, which is Inostronsevia. And we were able to go, we have one. And ours is, I think it was older than the other Christians. So we didn't get to publish on it first, but we got to say ours is older than yours. Now we have 2 African Inostronsevia. And then we have a second specimen in our collection that has this canine. I have a bunch of photos of me with it. The canine's probably 5 or 6 inches long. It's bigger than a Tyrannosaurus rex tooth. And that one we're pretty sure is also Inostronsevia africanus, but it's not 100%. But based on size, it totally is.
Nice.
That's really cool.
Do you have any advice for people who want to, dip their toes or get first involved in paleontology, whether that's in the field or maybe preparing? Is there a way that they can help out at the museum?
Absolutely. I highly encourage everyone to find the local museum and try and volunteer for it in the first place. There are lots of amazing opportunities to dig, but a lot of those require money to get your foot in the door. And not all of us have an opportunity to, or the ability to do that, to pay entry into an opportunity like that. But volunteering allows for you to no cost entry into paleontology. And at the Burke Museum, I have 46 volunteers in my fossil prep lab.
Wow.
And so that is it's an army of people who are all highly trained and get to work on our dinosaurs and on our Triassic and even our Permian animals. And that's a way that I can give back to the community and that they can get experience. But also half of my volunteers are students or are other people in the community who want to make fossil preparation their actual career. There is a history of people getting internships and then becoming a full-time fossil preparator without a paleo degree. So that is one of the routes into fossil preparation, at least historically. So the preparators that I have in my lab are all volunteers, but they are working on stuff that's getting researched. I have volunteers that have been trained and they do so well that they're working on holotype specimens for Christian Seedor's students. And they're a volunteer. They're a coffee barista in their daytime job. And then they come into the lab and they go, I'm working on a holotype cynodont from Africa. And I'm like, cool. Yes. So volunteering is a wonderful way to get your hands into paleontology and get experience with different aspects of paleontology, from the field to the prep to working in collections to cataloging. Usually you have an opportunity to, depending on what museum is nearby you, to volunteer in all different kinds of departments or positions in the museum to get an idea of what you want to do. And just because you're a volunteer doesn't mean you're not incredibly valuable to the team. Again, our volunteers, we could do anything without them. We could not get the amount of stuff processed that we do without them, the amount of research that's done without them. Our storage spaces would be so full of fossil jackets if I did not have an army of people to prepare these things. So volunteering is an incredible way to get exposed to fossils, to the field, to fossil prep, but also contribute to science in a meaningful manner. So I think if you are interested in paleontology, the first thing to do is find the local museums, get on their website, find the staff, email spam all of the staff and say, I am so interested in this. Here's a little bit about me and my hobbies and my background, and I would love to volunteer for you. And hopefully they'd be able to take you on. And yeah, I think volunteering is just the best gateway into paleontology.
Nice. For our listeners then, where's the best place for them to go and find out more about you and your work online?
To follow me and some of the adventures that we have in the fossil lab and in the field, you can follow me on Instagram at pinup_paleontologist. And you can follow our shenanigans as well on the Burke Museum's official Instagram and Facebook pages.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really fun conversation. And now I have a bigger appreciation for the Petrified National Forest. And I want to learn more about these interesting Triassic weirdos with their hook tails and everything.
Oh, yeah. The longer we do this, the more I get interested in the Triassic.
Yeah.
That is my whole goal in life. Make everyone want the Triassic and the Permian and forget the Cretaceous dinosaurs.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know about forget.
As I wear my T-Rex shirt.
Yeah. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelsie, for the fantastic interview. It's really cool hearing about all the ways you can get involved with paleontology, even if you're in a state that doesn't necessarily have any or maybe just one small dinosaur discovery to speak of.
Yes.
There's always ways to get involved.
And I love learning about prepping fossils. We'll get into our dinosaur of the day, Uteodon, in just a moment, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Uteodon, which was a request from Tyrant King via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. Uteodon was an Iguanodontian dinosaur that lived in the late Jurassic in what is now Utah in the US. It was found in the Morrison Formation.
See where that name comes from.
Yes, the genus name means Ute tooth, and it's named for indigenous people of Utah and Colorado. If you want the full name, the type species is Uteodon aphanoecetes, and that species name means hidden in plain sight. It looked similar to Camptosaurus. It had a rounded back, a bulky body, walked on two legs, had a long tail, as well as a long head and short arms. And it could walk on all fours or two legs. It had fused wrists. It's estimated to grow up to 20 feet or 6 meters long and weigh up to 880 pounds or 400 kilograms, although there's a smaller estimate that it was only a little over 8 feet long or 2.5 meters long. The holotype is a partial skeleton. It was named in 2011 by Andrew McDonald. There's some debate, though, over its classification. Originally, O.C. Marsh assigned the specimen that's now Uteodon to Camptosaurus medius in 1894, and Charles Gilmore confirmed it in 1925. The partial skeleton was found in 1923 at Dinosaur National Monument, which Gilmore briefly described in 1925 and referred to Camptosaurus medius. In that description, Gilmore wrote that the skeleton was in a large block of sandstone and the limb and hip bones were, quote, more or less disarranged.
I'm guessing on the more disarranged.
He also wrote, quote, in revising the genus in 1909, Camptosaurus medius was retained as a valid species and an attempt was made to characterize it. Owing to the unprepared state of the greater portion of the type materials, which were studied at the time, the results obtained were far from satisfactory. Keeping it real. Then in 1980, Camptosaurus medius was synonymized with Camptosaurus dispar.
Oh, so it got even more synonymized.
Yes.
Less unique.
Then in 2008, Carpenter and Wilson fully described the skeleton that Gilmore had described and designated it the holotype of Camptosaurus aphanoecetes. And they referred all specimens of Camptosaurus that were found in Dinosaur National Monument to this species. And all of those specimens were found between 1909 and 1923. This included a brain case. In 2011, McDonald found enough differences to rename it from Camptosaurus aphanoecetes to Uteodon. So McDonald referred all those fossils to Uteodon based on a unique feature in a brain case. There's a piece sticking out further in the back. Some other fossils included part of a right leg and foot. And other bones were found in a block as a mix of bones from a couple Camarasaurus and an ornithopod. The brain case was in that mix, while the right hind limb was from a different set of bones found. A lot of piecing things together. In 2015, Carpenter and Lamanna argued that the brain case and the right hind limb were not from the same individual and found the brain case to actually be Dinosaur, a late Jurassic ornithopod. Based on the remaining fossils, the hind limb as well as a partial skeleton and the specimens found in Dinosaur National Monument, they found that Uteodon was the same as Camptosaurus, and Uteodon wasn't valid, so they synonymized them. They said that what made Uteodon unique was actually damage to the fossil.
Oh, so what other people said was unique was just damage.
Yes. They also argued that other features McDonald said were unique to Uteodon were missing, or artifacts of different perspectives of photographs. But they did say there were still some unique characters, so it went back to being the species Camptosaurus aphanoecetes. So Uteodon became Camptosaurus again.
But within a different species. So it wasn't fully synonymized at this point, just in the same genus.
Yes. This species of dinosaur lived in an area with rivers and wetlands and a salt lake. And other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include the sauropods Apatosaurus and Diplodocus, iguanodonts like Dryosaurus and Camptosaurus, Stegosaurus, and theropods like Allosaurus and Torvosaurus. Other animals that lived around the same time and place include frogs, snails, turtles, lizards, crocodilomorphs, pterosaurs, and early mammals.
It sounds like we'll have to wait a little longer to see if Uteodon gets revised or not.
Mm-hmm.
Or I should say revived. Because there's a little bit of lumping and splitting and room for interpretation when you have unique features. But how many unique features do you need to make it its own genus?
How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? That's what that reminded me of.
I guess. And our fun fact of the day is that Komodo dragons could help explain why there is a weirdly low population of herbivorous dinosaurs in the fossil record. I've had this on my fun fact list for a little while because back when we interviewed Phil Curry, he mentioned that he saw a few Komodo dragons eat an entire pig, including the hair, in just 20 minutes.
Whoa.
Yeah. As he put it, there was nothing left but smell at the end. And if dinosaurs did this, there would be nothing left to fossilize. Phil Curry used this as a possible explanation for why we don't always find many herbivorous dinosaurs in the fossil record, and by that I mean by count, not number of species. In modern ecosystems, there are usually something like 20 times as many herbivores as there are carnivores by population. And in some dinosaur ecosystems, there are even numbers, or sometimes there are even more carnivores than herbivores, which seems completely backwards from what you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
It is amazing that Komodo dragons can completely devour an entire animal. Komodo dragons have much smaller teeth than all but the smallest carnivorous dinosaurs. The largest teeth only reach about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters long. I found that number reported a lot of places, but I think that might include the root of the teeth because the pictures I could see showing the actual anatomy of a Komodo dragon tooth shows only about 5 millimeters or less than 1/4 inch of actual sharp serrated tooth.
Oh.
Which is very, very small. 5 millimeter tooth on an animal that's like approaching 10 feet long.
Yes. So they have other ways of devouring their food.
Yeah. It's not the size of the teeth in the mouth, but the ambition of the eater. I don't know. That didn't work.
You tried.
Yeah. I usually give the amount of tooth that is above the gums, but Komodo dragon teeth are so small, they are almost completely covered by gums. Some of the teeth are completely covered by gums. I still haven't seen a satisfying reason for why they have such thick gums. If anyone knows, send us a message at bit.ly/dino questions, because it's a dino question that I have. Maybe not a dino question, but a reptile question. Komodo dragon teeth are zyphodont. Like a lot of carnivorous dinosaurs, they're curved and serrated, and they're thin from side to side like a knife. They do the puncture and pull sort of ripping motion like a lot of dinosaurs that have those teeth probably did. But Komodo dragons have another neat trick, and that's why I'm finally doing this as my fun fact. There was an article published earlier this year in Nature Ecology and Evolution by Aaron LeBlanc and others, and what they found is that Komodo dragon teeth appear to be iron-coated. And that's not an analogy. The title of the paper literally starts with iron-coated Komodo dragon teeth.
Whoa.
Which is a little bit absurd. The iron is mostly in the tooth tips and on the serrations, so it seems like it's reinforcing the places that would get the most wear. It's not obviously like a complete iron plating like you would see on something that's manufactured. It's just a higher amount of iron in the chemistry of the tooth. They did find that there's some iron in other lizards and crocodilians, but there was more of it in the Komodo dragon and in the closer related species to Komodo dragons. The iron amounts are too low to detect in dinosaur teeth fossils, at least so far. I'm hoping that someone figures out a way to see if there was this same sort of iron in those teeth, especially the ones that have the really similar Xiphidont teeth. And who knows, maybe that is a factor in how dinosaurs managed to devour so many things.
Maybe.
But even without iron in the teeth, it seems like if Komodo dragons can completely devour a pig, leaving nothing in about 20 minutes, a T-Rex should be able to do a lot more than that, because we know that they could probably just smash bones to bits too.
And maybe in less time.
Yeah. It also wouldn't have to be just one animal species eating the whole carcass, like with Komodo dragons, if we're just talking about whether or not the animal makes it into the fossil record. In most modern settings, dead animals go through phases with different animals eating them. It's not just one animal start to finish that eats the entire things. Obviously, sometimes there are, like Komodo dragons. You see it with crocodiles. You see it in other cases, especially with smaller animals where there's a big disparity in size between the predator and the prey. But I'm thinking of time lapses of animals going through phases of being eaten. Like you have, a lion, and then you have a hyena, and then there's vultures and whatever. And at the end of it, sometimes there's literally nothing left.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine if there are huge bone-crushing predators in the area, it's likely that an entire animal, skeleton and all, would be destroyed before there's a chance for anything to fossilize. And then looking in the fossil record these millions of years later, we're like, why are there so few herbivores?
Right.
It could just be that they all got eaten, just like we say the same thing about baby dinosaurs. Could be that there are so few baby dinosaurs in the fossil record because they just get gobbled up.
That's too bad. I'd like to know more about the baby dinosaurs.
We find them once in a while.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Don't forget, our next episode is our first book club episode, so grab your copy of Uncovering Dinosaur Behavior by David Hone, published by Princeton University Press, which is our sponsor for the episode. We'll be discussing the book in depth. It'll be a lot of fun. If you haven't grabbed your copy yet, you can use our link in our show notes to go to Princeton University Press and use the discount code PUP30 to get 30% off. Thanks again, and until next time.
Good day.